Okay, so we have here a model representing the human skull. So we'll start with the anterior presentation of the skull, and we'll look at the frontal bone with the glabella, the nasal bone, the maxilla, the zygomatic bones. Okay. Then we'll see the orbits. Within the orbits, we have here the optic canal, the superior and inferior orbital fissures. We have the lacrimal bone right here, and we also can view the ethmoid bone in yellow and the sphenoid bone in red. We have here the supraorbital fissure, the infraorbital fissure, aka foramen. We have the nasal cavity with the vomer and the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. We are also viewing the teeth articulating with the maxilla via the alveolar processes. Let's look at the superior aspect of the skull, and we'll see here that we can view the coronal suture, the sagittal suture. On the posterior aspect, we're looking at the occiput in blue. Here's the EOP, the external occipital protuberance. We also are viewing the lambdoidal suture. On the lateral view, we can see here the temporal bone, zygomatic bone, the sphenoid bone in red. We have here the zygomatic arch, the hole, the opening for sound waves to enter into the hearing apparatus. So we have here the external acoustic meatus. We're also viewing here the styloid process and the mastoid process. Okay. Now let's go to the inside of the skull with the calvarium removed. And what we're looking at here, folks, is that we have the anterior cranial fissure, cranial fossa, the middle cranial fossa, and the posterior cranial fossa. We can also view here the foramen magnum, sella turcica, and then we have two structures here in the anterior cranial fossa, the crista galli and the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. Let's take a look at the mandible. And as we look at the mandible, we have the mandibular symphysis right here. We have here the mental foramen, the mandibular foramen, the body of the mandible, the ramus of the mandible. We have here the coronoid process and the mandibular condyle, the mandible. Oh, also, as we're looking at the mandible, we can see that we have the teeth articulating with the mandible via these alveolar processes. On the inferior aspect of the skull here, let's see, okay, we have here the jugular foramen, the carotid canal, foramen lacerum, and then we have foramen ovale. It is a very oval-shaped hole. And then adjacent to it would be then foramen spinosum. And the last one would be the incisive fossa, aka the incisive foramen. Now you'll see here also that we have here the hard palate, comprised of the maxilla and also the palatine bone in pink. We're also viewing, as far as foramen magnum, occipital condyles, styloid process, mastoid process, and the fossa bilateral for the mandible. So the mandibular condyles will rest and articulate with the mandibular fossa. All right, very good.